The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Asha Curran, and on behalf of the Bronfman Center for Jewish Life and the 92nd Street Y, it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening to the second event in our Jewish Literary Exchange series with our moderator, Daniel Septimus, and tonight's guest, Gary Shteyngart. Before we begin, just allow me to take a quick moment to note a couple of our upcoming events. Next Thursday, October 26th, Ruth Messenger will join us to discuss the AIDS, HIV epidemic in Africa. That same evening, in our upstairs auditorium, authors Gadi Bloom and Nir Hafez will discuss the life of Ariel Sharon. And on Friday, October 27th, Rabbi Lawrence Kushner joins us to discuss Kabbalah. Now I would like to welcome back to the Y Daniel Septimus, who is moderator of our Jewish Literary Exchange this season, editor-in-chief of myjewishlearning.com, a book critic and columnist for the Jerusalem Post. I will leave it to Daniel to introduce tonight's guest, so without further ado, please help me welcome Mr. Septimus.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us, and you're in for a real treat tonight. We're honored to have Gary here, who's one of my favorite writers, and I've seen him, and he's good. I'll just introduce Gary, and then tell you about the structure for the evening, and then we'll have a conversation, and Gary's going to read a bit, and then at the end, we'll have time for your questions, and if you don't have the book, you can buy it outside after. Gary's first novel, The Russian Debutante's Handbook, was published in 2002 and won the Stephen Crane Award for First Fiction, as well as the National Jewish Book Award for Fiction. And his second novel, Absurdistan, which we'll be discussing tonight, was published in May. For me, the best novels are those that can take you through different frames of mind and different emotions. And Gary writes funny, satirical novels, but there's a lot of substance behind them, a lot of smarts. He discusses politics and identity and social issues. And for me, that's why they're fun to read, because they're entertaining and there's also a lot there. We'll talk for about 45 minutes. Gary will read at some point, and then we'll have your questions. So, Gary, first, I was going to summarize the book, but then I realized that you were here, so maybe you can just...
Oh boy. You want me to summarize the book? That's interesting. I'm about to go to Houston to read there, and I'm reluctant to talk about the role that Halliburton plays in this book. The story is the story of Misha Weingard, who is a 325-pound Russian Jewish behemoth, who ends up in a country named Absurdistan, which is administered by Halliburton. And Misha schemes his way to the top of a civil war that takes place between two ethnic groups that are pretty much exactly the same, except the Orthodox cross has this shape, as we know, and one of the footrests is shaped differently on the cross. So because of this, there's a terrible civil war and hundreds of thousands of people die. And Misha, our hero, works his way up to the top of the food chain by going out with the daughter of one of the rival dictators of the Republic. That's a very brief and kind of stupid introduction.
And how did the idea for the novel come about?
Well, the idea came about I was brought up in Leningrad in USSR, and when I was very young, my family would fly to Sukhumi, which, for those of you who aren't Russian, is in Abkhazia. It's a breakaway republic and a part of Georgia. And Sukhumi used to be a beautiful beach town, sort of think of it as the Soviet Florida, if you will. Palm trees and beautiful sandy beaches. And when we would go there, especially after the freezing environment of Leningrad, it felt so wonderful. I felt so alive in Sukhumi. And all my life, I've sort of dreamed about it until I was taken down to Disney World and had my Sukhumi dreams shattered by that big mouse. So I've always wanted, and also as a child, a lot of the stuff you read in Russia is set in the Caucasus. The most famous young man novel in Russia, Lermontov's A Hero of Our Time, A Hero for Our Time, I don't know what the English translation, is set in the Caucasus. And that was one of the first books that I read in Russian and loved it. And so to me, it was always a very romantic part of the world. And I've always wanted to set a book there. The other part of the book, the rather fat character, happened for several reasons. One was that I was very tiny as a child, but when I hit bar mitzvah age, I exploded. I became I had to wear a husky suit for my bar mitzvah. And the reason for that was, I guess, puberty is part of that. And I also had this grandmother who would feed me incessantly, maybe 7 hamburgers a day. She just stood there, by me and fed me over and over. So I became really large, and it really scared me because I was used to a much smaller frame. And all of a sudden I was sort of walking around like some kind of gastropod, And also, when I was a student at Oberlin College, which is my alma mater, there were many kind of small Russian Jewish boys, studying for their MCATs and their LSATs and whatnot, being good. And then there was this gigantic Russian guy who, just blew my mind. And he was raising these psychedelic frogs that he was licking and just running around after women. And he had this 6-foot bong. It was, I thought, this is a much bigger Russian Jew than what I've encountered. And he really blew my mind. He seemed so free. He was so unencumbered by all the complexes that I certainly had, being an immigrant, I was pretty poor when I was young, all these different things, but he was just enjoying life. So I thought if I was to write about a Russian Jew this time around, in my first book, the character was much more like me, a small, furry individual. And so for the second book, I decided to go the completely opposite route and have this behemoth of a man.
And a little more background about Misha, the protagonist here. So Misha, he's 325 pounds, and he's the son of the
1,238th
richest man in Russia. Yeah, and he's gone to college in the States, accidental college.
Accidental College is the name of it.
And he goes back to Russia. And while he's back there, his father has a Oklahoman businessman murdered named
Roger Daltrey.
And because
I go for the easy joke when I can. Yeah.
And because of that, Misha's not allowed back into America. And his goal here in this novel is to get back to New York and to his girlfriend from the South Bronx, Ruena. You mentioned that the first book is also about a Russian Jew, and I'm curious about how the transition from that book to this book felt.
Well, it was a very strange transition. The first book was fairly successful, which really shocked me because I thought it was. I wrote most of it when I was in Oberlin, and I thought it was such garbage. I kept throwing it out and recycling it. And then I sent it 5 years later to Chang-Rae Lee, who was my favorite immigrant author at the time, still is, a great guy, a Korean-American author, who read it and said, "Oh, we're going to get this published next week," and he did, which really shocked me. So when the book came out, and when there were all these mostly very positive reviews, and I started sort of being accepted by the literary world, such as it is these days, I thought, oh my God, I probably can never write another book again, because there felt like a lot of pressure. And in fact, I moved out of the country. I went to Italy for a while to work on this book, where most of it was written, because I didn't want to hear English or Russian for that matter. Although Russian I heard quite a lot in Rome. So I spent my time in Italy where I don't speak the language, and that was where most of this was written. And I think I wanted to do several things with this book. I knew I still wanted to pursue the Russian and American experience. I knew I hadn't exhausted that topic at that point. But at the same time, I didn't want to do a traditional immigrant comes to America, boy, his life is hard, and yet he perseveres no matter what kind of story. Not that the first book was really like that anyway, but I wanted to do something different. I wanted to have somebody who is not an American, not a Westerner, but who feels very at home in the world, on his own terms. And those terms are basically money. He has the money that he can afford to feel well in most parts of the world. And I think I remember when I was in Oberlin, there were several houses that you could live in. And one of the coolest houses was called Third World House. And Third World House conjures up the image of some kind of, impoverished, etc. But it was actually, I think, the wealthiest of the houses, because the people in that house, for the most part, represented the elites of various third world countries. And they were able to repatriate themselves with such ease from, say, Lahore or Islamabad or Delhi or Seoul. They were able so easily to travel between the world of America and Oberlin and its kind of liberal Midwestern college and their home countries. And that was sort of one of the ideas for Misha that I had. I wanted somebody who can move around the world with an ease that I never enjoyed and probably never will enjoy.
In a lot of ways, the book is heavy in the sense that it addresses big issues, globalization and oil politics and American imperialism, and obviously Halliburton plays a big role. And I'm curious how much Iraq was on your mind while you were writing this book.
Well, Iraq actually wasn't on my mind at all, because most of the plans for this book were written before 9/11. I had spent several months in many places, such as Baku, which is the capital of Azerbaijan, a very oil-rich place. And I spent most of my time just soaking it in by osmosis. So, in fact, I use my imagination very rarely. I'm more of a journalist who ventures out, takes a bunch of notes, and then turns it into something, turns it into fiction. So I would sit around, and there would be all these prostitutes running around, shouting with their Azeri and Russian-tinged accent, "Halliburton, Halliburton," trying to score one of the Halliburton execs sitting around. And I remember at one point, one of them came up to me and said, "You Halliburton?" And I said in Russian, "No, I'm just a writer." And she said, "Ah, phew, Russian writer. I am only for Halliburton." And so that one moment sort of crystallized for me where a lot of where we are in the world, in terms of writing, what's valued more, oil or literature, that's one thing I thought about, but also the way that that Western foreign policy plays a role in just the world at large. This was way before Iraq, of course. Although one of the things about that Halliburton, or KBR, Kellogg Brown and Root, which is a subsidiary of Halliburton, has this plan to fleece the U.S. government out of funds for rebuilding a country. And that actually, strangely enough, I researched that before the war in Iraq, but then now Halliburton, or KBR, is being sued for the very same thing. So I felt at least a little vindicated by history.
Yeah, I'm curious more about that. I mean, there's a moment where sort of a lot of the war in Absurdistan is playing out through the television, and everything is, the war is either going well or not well for either side of the civil war if it's getting the coverage it deserves. And the, I guess, crazy media frenzy around, around 9/11, then around the Iraq War. Were you rereading your stuff subsequently? And
no, once I finish a book, I just throw it away. I try not to, unless I'm forced to read from it, I try not to look at it, because it's really easier for me to just move on and deal with new topics. Well, what's interesting is I think, when I went around that part of the world, people were really upset that they didn't get coverage. What about our war? That's what people kept asking me. What about our war? And I remember right when 9/11 happened, the first series of emails I got from that part of the world was all about, we can't believe this happened, our feelings are with the American people, et cetera, et cetera. But as the months went on and the years went on, and then America began the war in Iraq, the feeling was more, well, I've been living at ground zero all my life. There's hundreds and thousands of people being killed all around me, and no one seems to care. So I think that all the characters in my book, who are from that part of the world, what they want more than anything is attention. And they kind of use the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a benchmark for what a good attention-getting war should be like. So they keep saying, well, we should be more like that. We should be more like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because that's what people can't stop talking about. How do we get to that level?
Your first novel, obviously, was also about a Russian Jew, but this novel seems to engage Jewish life in a much more overt way. I'm curious whether that was a conscious decision, or what the inspiration for that was. Were you aware of it while you were doing it?
Well, I think Jewish life, I've been sort of dealt three cards to play: Russian, American, and Jewish. And my favorite early literature, 19th century literature, of course, has been Russian literature. There wasn't that much Jewish literature at the time. But my favorite literature of the 20th century has been, without a doubt, Russian and Canadian Jewish literature. Bellow, Roth, and probably my favorite writer is the Canadian Mordecai Richler, who wrote possibly the best book of Jewish satire I've ever read, Barney's version. He wrote it and promptly died. It was that good. And I've spent a lot of time in Montreal just sort of following in his footsteps and drinking where he drank and eating smoked meat where he ate smoked meat. And so that to me was a sort of benchmark for what a good Jewish satire should be. I think my first encounter with Judaism was when we came to this country, obviously, and I was sentenced to 8 years of a conservative Hebrew school in Queens, which was a very jarring experience. My father was a very fervent, he really believed in Judaism in a way that really startled me. I remember going to speeches and hearing Rabbi Kahana speak. It was, and there were a lot of other Russian Jews who would go along with him. And he felt his whole life, he felt in Russia, of course, he felt the sting of anti-Semitism in a very serious way. So he wanted me to have, very understandably, he wanted me to have a good Jewish education. So I went to this school, and what was amazing was that Russians, don't forget, this was 1980 so Russians, this was the time of, all these movies, Red Dawn, Red Hamster, you name it. They had something out there, and it was so bad to be a Russian that I remember in Hebrew school pretending I was born in East Berlin, which I think gives you a nice idea of the magnitude of the. So, and I kept saying, well, I'm really a Jew, but that didn't really fly there. And the worst part of it was, of course, we Russians had a kind of fetish for kielbasa, which is often in pork form. And we would sneak in the kielbasa because it was only allowed a dairy lunch, of course. And we were caught in the bathroom by the rabbi having a little, this sounds too salacious, but a kielbasa party, if you will. And we were heavily reprimanded, and we were told that the Holocaust happened because people like us ate kielbasa. So that was, and I think the part that Daniel wants me to read is about the Holocaust later on, but that was sort of my first encounter with organized religion and Judaism.
So is it strange then, in some of our emails before, I was sort of joking, but I said, in a way you've been colonized by the Jewish community, that everyone wants a piece of you now. Is that sort of an odd experience?
What a piece. Well, this was my first experience was in the suburbs, but then the second experience was going to Stuyvesant High School in Manhattan, where there was a much different kind of Jew around, a very educated, liberal, progressive, happy-go-lucky kind of Jew. And I immediately felt a connection to this kind of urbane Manhattan Judaism. I would never live outside of Manhattan or maybe a sliver of Brooklyn. Or now Queens. It's spreading. So I felt very welcome. And that's the kind of sort of, and it was also, we were Jews in Stuyvesant, but we were mixed in with a whole array of people from everywhere, from Korea, from China, from India, from North Africa, Greece. So that felt like a much more welcoming environment. And that is sort of the goal of my hero. He dreams of this kind of multiculturalism that he discovers at Accidental College. But there he also learns to parrot the political line about multiculturalism, and then he uses that as a way to advance himself in the book. So, good and bad.
The last few years have seen a real proliferation of fantastic writing by Jews from the former Soviet republics, and people often group you and Lara, who was here last month, Lara Vapniar and David Bismosgis together, and I sort of go back and forth about whether this is appropriate or sort of an inappropriate fetishization of some sort of like
please fetishize it.
Non-literary aspect. And sometimes I think there's something to it, and I'm curious like what your feeling about that grouping is.
Oh, I don't mind. Some people say that they spend all their lives sort of crawling out of this ghettoization of, he's a Spanish writer, he's a Jewish writer, he's this or that. Philip Roth famously always said that, or was it, I'm confusing him with Saul Bellow, said that I want to be an American writer. I want to be known as an American writer. But I think these days the whole stigma of immigration has, at least in the Pacific and Atlantic parts of our country, it's less prevalent. I think people feel that it's all right to be hyphenated, that it's all right to have more than one identity. And I think a lot of that is because one is able to very easily go back. I go back to Russia every year. You know, it's 9 hours away. And I feel comfortable doing that, and I think a lot of people also do. So I think the role of immigration has changed, and the role of immigrants, at least in, I don't know what's going on in Alabama, I don't, but around here certainly it doesn't feel so. I'm sorry, what was the question? I can patter on for hours.
Yeah. Now, do you feel...
I'm sorry, Vapnyar and Bezmoskas, of course. Well, it's interesting. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the Russian Debutante's Handbook is, in fact, if Bezmoskas and Vapnyar had already published their book, I probably wouldn't have even started to write mine, because there was this incredible hole. There were books, excellent books by Dominican Americans, Korean Americans, you name it. And the one thing that seemed to be missing at that time were books by my generation of immigrants from Russia, which I found to be very interesting, because Russians, of course, come from possibly the greatest literary traditions of all literary traditions. And I was very surprised by why there weren't other Russian-American writers. We explored, when I talked about this with my fellow Russian friends, we explored several possibilities. One, the fact that even to this day my mother asks me, but who are you by profession? You know, what do you do for a living? So our parents obviously, as do parents of many other ethnicities, put a high premium on getting an education that will allow for some form of material success. And the other issue we talked about was this kind of shame that we felt, maybe, I don't know, coming from after maybe our experiences in our various Hebrew schools or whatnot. We felt scared of airing the dirty laundry, let's say. Whenever an immigrant, Philip Roth, well, he wasn't an immigrant, but he was a second or third generation. Whenever somebody from a community is the first or one of the first to write about what life is like for that community, there is inevitably a kind of backlash, or there's a lot of there's a feeling of he's giving away the store here. He's showing the rest of the world how we live, and here we are trying to fit in, trying to do better, trying to be Americans. So I think a lot of us felt very afraid of that, of sort of showing what our lives were like. But after my first book came out, in very rapid succession, 2 more books came out by Vapnyar and Bezmoskas, and I thought they were wonderful books. I thought what was so wonderful about them was that it would really be difficult to pigeonhole us as it being anything other than writers from the former Soviet Union. Lara Vapnyar is from a different planet, I think. You know, it's a wonderful planet.
Staten Island, I think, right?
Staten Island, yes. A planet far away. She writes in a kind of, you know, I think we all bridge the difference between English and Russian to some extent, but for her, Russian is the dominant language. For me, English and Russian are divided into different spheres. I talk mostly in English, I write in English, I dream a lot in Russian, the nightmares especially. I count money in Russian. All the anxious things seem to be associated with Russian, whereas ordering baklava happens in English. So, but for Lara, I think that equation, whereas for me it's 70-30, let's say, for her it's possibly in the other direction. And Bezmoskas has a yet different experience. He's not even American. He's a Canadian from Latvia, and he has a whole different approach to it. I think his stories have a more, well, first of all, those two are, well, no, Lara now wrote a novel, but is very well known for her collection of stories, as is Bezmoskas. And he has more of a kind of Hemingway-esque, I would say, approach to a kind of lean, muscular approach to literature, whereas mine is sort of, I don't know, Jewish hysteria, if you will.
We're going to get to your reading in a minute, but from my point of view, there's one really interesting commonality in your work, and that comes up in your work and in David's work. And that's, to a certain extent, I think Jewish fiction and immigrant fiction have been associated together because of the sort of first generation of Jewish American writers. And the immigrant is the outsider who can sort of peer into to America, as in the case of your Henry Roth and your Rise of David Levinsky, and I think one thing that you guys do is you're the outsider looking into the American Jewish community. So maybe the first generation was looking at the American community generally, and particularly in seeing this strange mixture of privilege that most of the American Jewish community has, and still sort of a preoccupation with victimization and suffering, and particularly as it comes up with the Holocaust. So I'm going to have Gary in a minute read something, but I actually want to, just to frame the context, read something briefly from David's work, just to show this commonality. So this is from David's story, Roman Berman massage therapist, in which his family goes to dinner at a wealthy Torontonian Jewish house called and their names are the Kornblums. And there's another family there of Russians, and the Torontonians keep asking them, are you refuseniks? How bad was it? How bad was the anti-Semitism? So I'm just going to read this briefly. After Gennady finished his story and tucked his shirt back into his pants, Gennady's the Russian man, Jerry and Rhonda wiped tears from their eyes. They couldn't believe it was so horrible. My parents had to agree, it was horrible. Kornblum said those Russian bastards and then asked if Simon and I wanted to go down to the basement and play. Kornblum's children, a boy and a girl, were away at sleepover camp. That was too bad. They would have been so excited to meet us. Downstairs in the basement was a ping pong table, a pool table, a hockey net, and some other toys. As we went down, Frida was telling a story about her mother who was stuck all alone in Kharkov. My parents weren't saying anything. Aside from the ping pong and pool tables, Kornblum's basement also had a big screen television and a wall unit full of board games and books. In the corner, one of his kids had assembled the complete Star Wars Death Star. All the Star Wars figures were there, including Ewoks. I went over the ping pong table. A paddle lay on top of a ball. I picked up the paddle and looked over at Simon. Simon wasn't interested in ping pong. He was inspecting the Death Star. In Russian, I asked him if all that stuff his father had said really happened. Are you calling my father a liar, he said, and picked up an R2-D2 doll. He picked up another toy and stuffed them both down his pants. What doesn't this rich bastard have, he said. When I returned to the table, everyone was there except my father and Rhonda. Shirley was sitting beside my mother admiring her amber necklace. Kornblum had a photo album out and was showing Gennady and Frida pictures of his grandfather in Poland. Jerry also had a pile of old photographs on the table. On his father's side, his family was from Minsk. All the dinner plates had been cleared, and there were now some pastries on the table and a pot of coffee. I had to go to the washroom, and Kornblum said, "There was one downstairs and 3 upstairs, take your pick." He then turned the page in the album and pointed out everyone the Nazis had killed. And there's this moment here where sort of this, and we're seeing it from the outside, where privilege is wrapped up together with this sort of strange obsession with suffering. And the piece that Gary's going to read now is, in my mind, and I've written this, so it must be true, really one of the most profound and insightful looks at contemporary American Judaism, particularly the connection between rhetoric about Jewish continuity and rhetoric about the Holocaust. So just to give some context for where we are in the novel, in Absurdistan, the SIVO, who are one of the parties in the Civil War, have asked Misha to be their ambassador to Israel, basically, and he's sees himself as a multiculturalist, and doesn't see himself as that kind of Jew, as he would say, and offers instead to be the minister of multicultural affairs. But to sort of throw them a bone, he decides that to court America, and therefore to court, they want to court Israel so they can court America. What the SIVO need is a Holocaust museum. So the part that Gary's going to read is the grant proposal that Misha writes for the Holocaust Museum, and it's satirical and it's edgy and it's incredibly brilliant also, I think.
Thank you. I've never read this in front of any audience, Jewish or not, and you'll see why. Okie doke. So this is Misha's proposal. The Institute for Caspian Holocaust Studies, aka the Museum of Sevo-Jewish Friendship. Project overview. By the way, I worked for many years in UJA affiliated organizations where I had to write many proposals like this. Yeah. Project overview. The greatest danger facing America's Jewry is our people's eventual assimilation into the welcoming American fold and our subsequent extinction as an organized community. Due to the overabundance of presentable non-Jewish partners in a country as tantalizingly diverse and half-naked as America, it is becoming difficult, if not impossible, to convince young Jews to engage in reproductive sex with each other. Efforts to connect Jews of reproductive age through professional social networks and alcohol-fueled meat markets have had limited success. Israel, once a source of pride and inspiration, is now populated largely by an aggressive Middle Eastern people whose bizarre lifestyle is thoroughly incompatible with our own. C.F. Greenblatt, Roger, why does hummus leave a bitter taste in my mouth? Journal of Modern Jewry, Indiana University Press. It is time to turn to the most affected, time-tested, and target-specific arrow in our quiver, the Holocaust. Even among the most thoroughly secular and unaffiliated young Jews, the Holocaust enjoys great name recognition. When asked to identify the following 8 components central to Jewish identity, Torah, Mishnah, Talmud, Holocaust, Mikvah, Whitefish, Israel, Kabbalah, only Whitefish scored higher than Holocaust. In a survey of 30 drunk Jews at a nightclub in suburban Maryland, C.F. Greenblatt, Roger, oi, what a feeling, I'm Jewish. Journal of Modern Jewry, Indiana University Press. The Holocaust, when harnessed properly as a sort of guilt, shame, and victimhood, can serve as a remarkable tool for Jewish continuity. The problem is the oversaturation of the Holocaust brand in media and academia, creating the need for a fresh, vibrant, and sexy approach to the mother of all genocides. The newly independent Seva Republic, run under the democratic and Israel-friendly auspices of the State Committee for the Restoration of Order and Democracy, SCROD, is a small but attractive nation-state on the shores of the beautiful Caspian Sea. The history of Sevo-Jewish friendship runs as deep as the waters of the Caspian. Both are educated, entrepreneurial, and maligned people fighting with their much larger ox-like neighbors for their share of love, recognition, and adequate living space. In 1943, as Hitler's Operation Barbarossa thundered toward the peaceful oil reserves of the Caspian, the Sevo population began a voluntary campaign to transport the entire native Jewish population out of the Republic and towards safety in Stalin's Siberia. Today, the country remains easily the most Jew-tolerant place on earth outside of Brookline, Massachusetts. This philo-Semitism, combined with an exotic location, the chance to enjoy the hospitality of a righteous people, finally an entire nation of tzaddikim, and the opportunities of a temperate, beach-filled landscape, most reminiscent of Cancun, Mexico, only cheaper, much cheaper, creates the perfect environment for an education-based initiative that is a world apart from the hackneyed death marches of Auschwitz-Birkenau and Yad Vashem. Methodology, a striking architectural design. Some of the world's most remarkable recent architecture has been built in commemoration of the Holocaust, but much of it is too abstract and cerebral to inspire immediate continuity in the loins of a frigid Jewish woman in her 30s. The Institute for Caspian Holocaust Studies will take the shape of a giant broken matzah in reference to the tragedy that befell our people, and as a reminder of the Passover meal, which among all the traumas of a Jewish upbringing consistently rates as the least scarring. C.F. Greenblatt, Roger, why on this night of all nights do I take only 1 milligram of lorazepam? Journal of Modern Jewry, Indiana University Press. The main exhibition space in the broken matzah will lead to a titanium-clad lamb shank, hint Frank Gehry, symbolizing both the forearm of the Almighty and our newly found brute strength. 2, the new tribalism. Identity politics are a great boon to our quest for continuity. Identity is born almost entirely out of a nation's travails. For us, a prosperous, unmolested people safely nuzzled in the arms of the world's last superpower, as of this writing anyway, this means Holocaust, Holocaust, Holocaust. The twin halves of broken matzah will be infused with the spirit of the new tribalism that is captivating young people across the Western world as an angry response to global homogenization. The first half will show the past travails of the Jewish people. A parallel series of walk-in closets will do the same for the Sevo people. And the second half will show how easily we forget how much they hate us. To be a bit reductive, first half, unpronounceable. Kristallnacht, Kindertransport, Krakow Ghetto, Chernowitz, Wadokic, Dobrkic. Second half, guilt-inducing. Towering videos of Jewish college boys at fraternity mixers hitting up demure Korean girls, while pretty suburban Jewish Maidala fetishize their urbanized African-American counterparts at a Smith-Barney softball game. Subtext, 6 million died and you're twirling around a bar stool with some chazer? 3, Holocaust for kids. Studies have shown that it's never too early to frighten a child with images of skeletal remains and naked women being chased by dogs across the Polish snow. Holocaust for Kids will deliver a carefully tailored miasma of fear, rage, impotence, and guilt in children as young as 10. Through the magic of animatronics, claymation, and Jurassic technology, the inane ramblings of underqualified American Hebrew Day school teachers on the subject of the Holocaust will be condensed into a concise 40-minute bloodbath. Young participants will leave feeling alienated and profoundly depressed, feelings that will be partly redeemed and partly thwarted by the ice cream truck awaiting them at the end of the exhibit. The Think It Can't Happen Again annex? Yeah, you think so? Well, think again, friend. This daring conceptual space will feature dozens of French Arab youth throwing rocks at passive museum goers, threatening 6 million more, while passive French intellectuals stand by in the shadows, smoking and drinking, smoking and drinking. For safety reasons, the rocks will be made out of 100% recyclable paper, and the French Arab youths will be caged. 5, the titanium-clad lampshank. We end the museum on a high note, celebrating the achievements of cutting-edge American Jews through life-affirming exhibits such as David Copperfield, The Myth and the Magic, and Onwards and Sidewards, The Death of Literature and the Birth of the Sitcom. A room or two can be devoted to Israeli cultural achievements, or not. 7, the tent of consent. This is where it all comes together, where continuity gets its capital C. Upon entering the tent of consent and submitting a blood sample and credit check, Jews of reproductive age, 34 to 51, will show Hitler and his goons just where they can stick their final solution. Here the word no is not an option. Here there is no diaphragm. Note, tents should be rugged and green to denote summertime reproduction. No circus tents. This is serious business. And now a word from our sponsor. As an opportunity to reach out to the true hellmouth of American political power, evangelical Christians will be given their own, much smaller tent from which they can proselytize to reproductive Jews emerging all sweaty and wobbly from the tent of consent. We estimate only 1% to 2% of our most expendable stock will actually fall for this crude Goyish siren song. A small price to pay, and our lobbyists will thank us. Outcomes, first year of operations. 1, 200,000 Jews will sow an additional 100,000 Jews on the shores of the Caspian Sea. 2, 2,000 to 4,000 lackluster Jews will become born-again Mormons or whatever the hell, and will stop pulling the rest of us down. 3, 20,000 Jewish children will learn that it's somehow their fault.
Thank you for clapping. Makes me feel a lot better about asking you to read that.
Wow, I've never read that. I need some lorazepam.
Yeah. No, but to echo...
Yeah, good. Give me the IV.
Yeah, to echo something in there, this is serious business. I mean, this is there are a lot of real ideas and insights here, obviously wrapped up in serious satire and laughs. And I'm curious where the idea for it came from.
Well, Mordecai Richler actually preceded me in a very hilarious, in Barney's version. I think in some other novels he had a fundraiser for UJA in Montreal who would call Barney the hero of the book every time some anti-Semitic act took place in Montreal. And he would say, "This is great, somebody shot on the stairs of the temple. More contributions are coming in as we speak." So there was this idea of using anti-Semitism, a Holocaust, etc., as a kind of tool. And it's a horrifying thing to do, obviously, but my hero is fairly horrifying in his own way and finds that this is something that can possibly work. And I guess going back again, I think there's the reason. The first response is one I've already discussed, which was a very visceral response to being told that the Holocaust was my fault as a child in the kielbasa bathroom. So all these different, both an emotional reaction, being exposed to all these films about the Holocaust, and believe me, this little school did not stint on that at all, and at the same time being in a way connected to that, being told that you share some blame for this, and that all your actions from here on, who you choose as a spouse, who your friends are, what your connection is with your community, everything is in some ways connected to this event with which I had no, what did I know as a child who grew up in 1972? So all these different things came together, and partly a visceral reaction and partly an intellectual reaction to all the different ways in which the Holocaust is well, for lack of a better word, marketed.
Right. And does it seem distinctly something that comes from the American Jewish community?
No, I think it's well. In Russia, it was a very different scenario because so many, a large part of my family perished in the Holocaust, but even more perished in Stalin's death camp, in Gulag, Archipelag, all this stuff. There was it was a more diffuse reaction. We all lost relatives in many terrible, Russian Jews sort of paid the price as no other ethnicity did because they were surrounded by both sides from Hitler and Stalin. So I think there was a very keen appreciation of just what had happened. But the way it was presented in America was certainly very different from anything that I had encountered.
We'll get to questions in a minute, but I'll just ask what you're working on now.
Well, I've decided, it's very strange. I've decided to write a novel that had nothing to do with Russian Jews, and its protagonist is a Russian Jew, which is sad in a sense because it shows what my limited capacities are, but also it shows just how little I have assimilated into America in a sense, that I can't even branch out beyond this sort of Russian phenomena. But it's not about Russia. It's not really about Judaism. It's about immortality. It's about the decline of literature. And it's slightly futuristic. It's set about 5-10 years into the future. And it's about Korean evangelicals. That always gets a laugh, yeah. I don't know why. So I'm spent a lot of time I'm going to spend a lot of time in Southern California hanging out at some pretty snazzy Korean churches. Some of them have translations, so you can hear it in English. It's very exciting. So I'm 50 pages into it. It's kind of a hodgepodge, but I do want it to be, and I think it has satirical aspects, but I don't think it will be on the same level of satire. I think it'll be a much more. I'm trying to change my tenor a little bit to something else. So for me, it's experimental, but probably less satirical than what's preceded it.
Does anyone have questions?
Or complaints? Or
yeah.
You left Russia when you were quite young, back in
Seven, yeah.
Yet you say you go back to Leningrad every year, and you feel Russian. Yet, in a sense, a great part of your life was not in Russia. What draws you back to Leningrad? Do you have family there? Do you
My family is all here, so I go to escape them.
well, that's a good reason.
Yeah, they're all in Long Island. Well, I was born in, well, it's now St. Petersburg, although I still believe that's in Florida. It's an interesting question. I think, and when I say I feel myself Russian, that's also a very complicated statement. Obviously, I don't feel as Russian as I do American at this point. But I feel almost more comfortable when I'm on a plane between the two countries than I am when I land in either. I think there was something missing growing up. All that denying that I was from Russia, pretending I was from East Berlin and Hebrew school and all these different things, it really parted me from a part of myself. And in a strange way, my parents wanted more than anything for me to be a successful American. They've never been back to Russia. They have no desire to go back. For them, it's this horrible country where they just suffered intense anti-Semitism. But for me, especially when I went to college, where in Oberlin, being an immigrant, boy, that was about the coolest thing you could be. You could hang out at Third World House, bake blini, you could do all these different things, as my protagonist, the gigantic man, discovered. So there it was fashionable to discuss where you were from. And it was almost a cathartic experience. I started talking about my background, which I had kept silent about for so long. And my major in Oberlin was political science. And I wrote it about Georgia, Tajikistan, and Moldova, 3 republics undergoing civil wars. And little did my thesis was such bull, but it was called Back in the USSR. And the idea was that the Soviet Union would get back together and destroy America once and for all, which the Marxist faculty really loved. I was given some red star of courage or something. But little did I know that very fictional essay would become the genesis for Absurdistan in some ways, because I was already gathering the facts. I had no idea I would turn it into a book. And so in '99, I went back for the first time to Russia. Had almost a heart attack. I just, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, because in my mind, the period of my childhood was a magical one, dreaming of joining the Red Pioneers. I wrote my first book when I was very young. I was about 4 or 5, and my grandmother, who was a journalist, asked me to write a book about Lenin and a magical goose named Goose Martin. So I wrote this little book about how Lenin and the goose become good friends and invade Finland and convert Finland to socialism. And in the end, Lenin eats the goose, of course, for political expediency. So for me, I always dreamt of this wonderful past that I had. And, a childhood in the Soviet Union up to a certain age, up until the age where, somebody can call you a yid, to know that, and that happens pretty quickly. Up to a certain point, it used to be, at least back then, it had its moments. There was a bookishness, there was a very cultured element, certainly in Petersburg, Moscow, the other very big cities. I remember just days spent just walking through museums. Also, Russians, in the Soviet Union, people were fairly underemployed. I mean, nobody did a 90-hour work week. So parents and grandparents had the time to take you around, to teach you things. It was this wonderful experience. So I came back in '99, and this was this completely decrepit third world country. Most of the money was in Moscow, still is concentrated in Moscow. Petersburg is looking better and better these days, but at least when I came back and I saw my friends who were living in the suburbs, some of the worst suburbs, I was just shocked at the disparity that I saw between what I had remembered and what the real conditions on the ground would be. And I was also incredibly fascinated, more so than I have ever been by anything in my life. And I went one year, then I came back another year and a third year and so on, and I couldn't stop going. And I thought, well, once I finish the research material for Absurdistan, I will lose interest. But although my next book is not set in Russia, I feel a closeness to people, and maybe, and this is more of a Russian or a Jewish thing, maybe a closeness to people's suffering, because that kind of suffering exists in few parts of the world, and it's something that I find it's not therapeutic in any sense, but it's just something that I feel on a very soulful level that I don't feel if I live in Italy or somewhere else.
Other questions?
Could you talk about the writers that you like, especially current writers?
Current writers, there's so many. Well, Bizmozgis and Vapier we discussed. There's a guy, Sam Lipsyte, who wrote a book called Homeland. Are you familiar? He teaches up at Columbia. Really funny stuff. Also a Jewish American writer. Just really hits the mark. Nicole LeBlanc wrote a brilliant book called Random Family. She graduated from Brown and lived for 10 years in the South Bronx with a family. Just you really root for them because it's one of the most frightening books I've read about the American underclass since, I think, Call It Sleep, since Henry Roth. This is about a Latino family, not a Jewish family, but there are some similarities, the insularity of it, the lack of hope. But what's really poignant is the way she writes about them in a very dispassionate way. She just basically takes you through what it's like to live in their skin for a few days. But the result is just, you feel for these people in a way I haven't felt, and this is nonfiction, in a way I haven't felt for a fictional character in a long time. It won many awards. She's just a tremendous writer. Her next book is about stand-up comedy, so it's a big change.
I was just double-checking because you haven't mentioned, and I know I've read stories of yours in the New Yorker, right?
Yeah.
And do you write short stories in between, or?
I'm really bad at short stories. Oh, thank you. But mostly, actually, most of the stuff in the New Yorker are excerpts that are carefully repackaged to become a New Yorker story with a beginning, middle, and an end. But mostly, I'm just pillaging my own work. What I love to do is travel writing. This is my favorite thing. This is what I live for. And I'm a contributing editor to Travel and Leisure. And I get so tired of fiction. It's to do it, I think, consecutively, to have that as your main occupation all the time. I think it's often a disservice to the fiction that one writes. And I think it's just so eye-opening I try to do 3 continents every year, to end up on 3 continents every year, and always rush. I'm always pigeonholed, and I just did a piece on a Siberian wedding in St. Petersburg for some reason. But I tried at least the other 2 pieces to always be in Asia or in South America or someplace like that. And that is just such a great experience because you really get to see how people live. And I try to write in a different style than I do from my fiction. And it's interesting because when you write travel writing, you have a goal. Your goal is here. I like to entertain the reader, etc. But there, you actually have a goal to show a reader what it would be like for them to go to a certain place, and that puts a kind of restriction on what you can do. And I somehow find that restriction welcoming. So it's been wonderful.
To refer you to one piece that you mentioned earlier, the trip to Montreal to follow in Mordecai Richler's or Barney Panofsky's footsteps. You can still find online on Slate.com.
Slate.com,
and it's very worthwhile.
Yeah, the best thing is they pay you to actually go and drink, in all these different places.
Yeah. Was there a question over there? Yeah.
I have a question. I was trying to understand your definition of Judaism. What's important to you in Judaism? Insularity, about suffering, about family, maybe again?
Family. Well, I look at Judaism as a cultural entity, and I look at it, especially what interests me is 20th century cultural Judaism, for example, with literature. My Judaism begins, I think, with Augie March. I think that's the beginning of it, and I think it somehow ends with the death of Barney Panofsky and Mordecai Richler. Now, the question is, what does that leave in terms of practice? I'm not a religious person, so I don't practice Judaism. What does that leave in terms of family? Well, my family's Jewish, so, and I am Jewish. What else does that leave? An interest in Freudian psychoanalysis, I think. Membership at the Jewish Museum. Every once in a while, a trip to Israel to eat some decent fava beans. Some other things, but mainly that. I guess that's not a very inclusive list.
But the book itself is, engages Jewish life and Judaism in I think really insightful and profound ways. So it's sort of this book made this session easy on me because, in a sense, we're always like, okay, what's a Jewish book? What's a Jewish writer? Who do we invite? We want the writing to be good, so that limits it. But this book is clearly engaging Jewish issues. Maybe not in a self-conscious way. Maybe not even as a first priority. But in a way that I think is whether you wanted to or not, I think for a lot of people a worthwhile and productive Jewish experience.
And of the many nationalities that have complained about this book, and my parents always said, oh, you'll get killed by the Jews, especially. But the Jews have complained least. Number 7, Russians came out first, very upset, ethnic Russians. Not Russian Jews. Then Azeris, Armenians, a farmer in Canada who raises nutria was very upset, and some other folks. So I came out all right.
I'll go there.
Of many of the ironies I kind of took away from the book was that it was a political commentary on Iraq, which you kind of said that's not the case. So then what is the connection between your kind of ending it near September 11th? Was that kind of to implant that idea, but really not, or?
Yeah, the September 10th ending, not to give it away for anyone who hasn't read it. Well, I think I wanted, and when I was writing this, there were several discussions. My editor had said, I have a wonderful editor, and he said, well, why don't you just take us a little further, and maybe we could do 9/11 too, Throw that in, and instead of $24.95, we can do $26.95. Think about it, And I really wanted this book to end. I wanted this book in the end. The book is partly about America, but I wanted it to be about the other parts of the world. Because I think that whole part of the world that's between Iran on one side, Turkey on another side, and Russia on the other side, there's these behemoths that are pressing down on each side. I think it's completely ignored. By calling this book Absurdistan, a lot of people had no idea, the Stan is a joke. People don't understand what that part of the world is from. And I think especially I felt that after 9/11, and when people really commiserated with people from that part of the world really commiserated with New Yorkers, Washingtonians, etc. And yet who right now knows the fact that, for instance, in Moscow as we speak, Georgians are being rounded up, put on planes and sent back to Georgia because of a dispute between Georgia and Russia. And in certain schools, teachers are told to compile names of Georgian students with visibly Georgian or audibly Georgian names to give to the police. Very few people know that in America. And I kind of wanted to put the spotlight on a part of the world because I know that the spotlight is always on America, and it's always on Israel and Palestine, etc. And I wanted to do something different here.
Two related questions about Misha, actually. When you introduce us to Misha, you have him trapped in Russia as a result of his father's actions, really no actions of his own, as though he's actually literally trapped in his father's world. I wonder if you see him getting free from that, and how does he become free? And do you think about stuff like that in your writing?
I think about that stuff a lot, and I think very much about, my parents are unique characters, one can say. They are strong individuals, and they've lived through a life that makes people strong, or they fail, And I think I wonder if people who are the products of very strong parents, if they're able to, in some ways, ever separate themselves from their parents, if they are able to create their own kind of world, or if they're forever stuck in the world of their parents. The New York Times, I think, did a thing about how Judaism teaches you to break away from your parents and run away somewhere. I think there was did I misread it? I think I read it the way I wanted to hear it. Right, perfect. I wanted somebody, Misha, who claims to be everything his father's not. He's multicultural, he de-emphasizes his Judaism and emphasizes his love of Latino women, for example. But at the end of the book, he's completely trapped in his father's world. He is completely unable to make any decision that in any way is not a reaction to his father, and to some degree to his mother. So, and some people say that it's like trying to get out of a sack. The more you fight, the more you get embroiled in this, the more you can't get out of the sack. You have to be calm, collected. You have to be a real Houdini to escape from this world of your parents. But that's something Misha is unable to. And if he were able to, then I think the comedy of the book would sort of wither on the vine. What interests me is people who don't make it.
Do we have another question here? No? Yeah.
I work here at the Y. I just wanted to let everybody know that we have a Sunday monthly series called Russian Sundays, and it's a cultural salon, if you will, music, art of Russian Jews. So I encourage you to look on our website, 92y.org, or in the catalog, and please come.
Questions? Yeah, over there.
I'm also a Russian Jew, and I absolutely love your books.
Thank you.
And I admire the way you embed the Russian words.
Some not so nice.
So my question, I guess, is what's the level of your Russian, and if it's good, do you write in Russian?
I speak fairly well. I understand perfectly. I read perfectly. My handwriting is impossible in any language, so it's hard to see. But yes, I do read Russian newspapers almost every day online. Some of the best stuff, I think, is stuff like Gazeta.ru. And I speak to my parents a lot, of course, because they're Russian Jewish parents. So they have a red line to my, like they used to have in the Politburo. So I'm very thankful that I'm able to keep up my Russian and also to read a lot of books in Russian that are published these days. And the yearly trip helps. And I think the dreaming helps. Dreaming in Russian, even though I don't associate it with my best dreams, the one of hopping around with the elderberries, that's usually in Italian. But there is a very strong psychic connection to all things Russian. And I'm very thankful for that. And I think that other writers are often envious of that and say to me, I'm stuck writing about my parents' divorce in Westchester, So it's very helpful.
Have the books been translated into Russian?
Yes, the first book has been. In fact, I did a little help with that. I had a little bit to do with the translation, which may explain its shoddiness. It was translated by a woman, I think, in her 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And there was a lot of foul language, and everything I write is pretty awful. A lot of foul language, and she would write the first letter of the genital or something, and then ... So I would insist she fill in the entire genital. I insist.
And do you have a sense if people are reading Has it sold well in Russia?
Oh, no, please. Their response was, I don't even know how to sort of, a salo ruskoye едят, and he still eats Russian lard, and yet he criticizes us, you know. It was very, actually, it wasn't that bad. I'm hoping for Macedonian sales. I think that's what's really going to hit a nerve.
Yes.
Yeah, you made a couple of references, offhand references to decline of interest in literature and the like, and you didn't mention, you mentioned Roth and Bellow, you mentioned Bellow and you mentioned Rikla, who got a chance to write during maybe one of the greatest explosive periods of literature and serious interest in literature, popular interest. A lot of these people wrote best-selling books, which is rather amazing today. So what's it like to work in a very different world?
It's a great question. In fact, online right now on Slate.com, I do a dialogue with an excellent critic, Walter Kern. Excellent because he gave me a good review.
I was just going to say that. Yeah, I wasn't going to let that go,
That's why I love
Gary.
him. Otherwise, he'd be mediocre at best. I do a kind of dialogue with him about the future of literature. Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint, which received quite a reception from the Jewish community at the time, with many literary pogroms forecast, none of which, of course, had happened. Sold 400,000 copies in its first year. Nowadays, Mitch Ablom, or that guy, or whatever, that's the only... Can you imagine a work of serious literary merit? 400,000 copies the first year. It was a different time. What's interesting to me, and I do teach on occasion at Columbia, is that the fewer people read, the more people want to write. 80% of Americans polled said that they had a book in them that was just dying to get out. But would 80% of Americans read a book every year? I highly doubt it. We live, I think, in a culture where people have very little time to have empathy for another kind of person, another person's point of view, living in another person's skin. One example is only 1% of literature sold in America is literature in translation. In a country like Germany or France, that's maybe 40, 50, 60%. Even Italy, which doesn't read much, has a much higher percentage. I think in America we are more interested, we are in the YouTube generation, and people want the spotlight to be on themselves. They want, when you're playing a video game, you're not watching passively as other creatures struggle with 12-level orcs or whatever. You are the hero. And you are special, and I think most Americans these days have that in their as part of their growing up, and that is why there is such an explosive growth in MFA programs. A lot of them produce very wonderful graduates. I went to one myself. There's no connection. Very good graduates, and I went to one myself. I put that in there, and. But as these programs continue to grow, the decline in actual readership is startling, especially in the 18 to 25 demographic. The NEA did a report. I mean, it's a 10% decline every decade. So we have what, five decades left of anyone even reading this stuff? And they're trying in some ways to change course. I was just in San Francisco, which is possibly the most literate small town, or medium-sized town in America, and everywhere I saw there were billboards, read, you must read this book. And I don't know what effect that really has on participation, but the idea is, right now, I think it's important to start a different kind of cultural movement, and one that I think stresses empathy and stresses knowing more about other people than one already knows about oneself. And that's a hard sell. Where in America and also now in other parts of the world, too.
You spend time online reading Russian newspapers and probably checking out what's happening in Georgia and all these other places.
Yeah.
Even a writer doesn't get enough opportunity to read something between two hard covers.
Absolutely. It's well, the internet is a double-edged sword in many ways. It's been incredibly helpful for the research part of everything I write. And I do find a lot of it's absolutely fascinating. And also, the thing about the internet is that it's very liberating because in some countries, and Russia now is veering toward this, there is a kind of censorship that exists if you print something on a press. But if you put it online, if you smuggle it online, and there's many ways to do that, then there's things that you can publish online that you can't actually publish physically. So there's many wonderful things, but yes, that does detract. I don't mind people reading my books off the screen. I write them on the screen, so I have no. If in the future the book migrates to the internet, that's fine, as long as it exists, in some form. I think the novel is still an incredible way of communicating to the world, of really embedding another. It's like wearing imagine slicing my gigantic man open and putting his skóra, his fur, his pelt on you, and walking around with that. And that's what I aim for. And you can't really do that in anything but a novel.
Other questions? Yeah, okay.
I was wondering what the reaction in Israel?
This hasn't come out yet. It's not been translated yet in Israel. The other book,
I reviewed it for the Jerusalem Post and gave it an excellent review.
You did?
Yeah.
So the reviews have been excellent. All right.
Yeah.
That's the only thing they have there in Israel, right? The Jerusalem Post.
Yeah. Haaretz, yeah.
Haaretz.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
You just made a comment which struck me, which is getting into the pelt. I think you used the term of the character in the book, and yet you chose the most alien character for us to, in fact, get into. And I am certain there had to have been some reason behind that, other than the fact you met this wonderfully liberated guy at Oakland.
Well, that was a big reason. I mean, I wish I could bring him. I should do a kind of show and tell where he pops up and hands out frogs and whatnot. That was a big reason. But I also, my first hero felt a little too easy. I had a big bushy goatee in the time, and he had a big bushy goatee and a receding hairline. I mean, it was just picture perfect. And that's the first book. And people would, people in the street would say, "Hey, it's Vladimir." It's Vladimir in Russian, but So I wanted to challenge myself a little bit. And I said, if I'm going to do another Russian Jew, he better be the biggest Russian Jew I can create. And he better embody both Russia and America. And what I wanted to do with that was somebody who consumes all the time. And Misha is the greatest consumer, I think, in the world. He swallows everything. He swallows yellowtail sushi. He swallows kolbasa. He swallows political ideas, And his little red book is the Zagat Survey to New York, and he writes love poetry based on that book. So I wanted to create a real consumer that could symbolize both the American consumer and the very burgeoning Russian consumer. Russia is becoming possibly, along with some other countries such as China, possibly the most consumers-driven society in the history of mankind, which is understandable because consumers' goods were obviously unavailable through the last 100 years to such an extent. But I wanted Misha to be a swallower of worlds. And there you run the risk because you're going to alienate some readers. Not everybody wants, I'm shocked by this, but not everybody wants to read about a 325-pound man. And that's to the detriment, I think, of the sales of the book. But I couldn't have done it any other way.
I want to thank Gary for joining us. And
thank you. Thank you.
To help with make up for all the people not buying the book because of the 325-pound man, there are books outside for you to buy, and I'm sure Gary would be willing to...
I'll sign anything, even somebody else's books.
Yeah. And thank you for coming, and please join us again on December 20th for Alice Madison. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.